Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into Victorian Britain. Not into the grand drawing rooms or polished tea parlors that history books like to show us, but right into the streets where hunger met desperation, and desperation met some of the most questionable snacks ever invented. Imagine yourself walking through London in the mid-1800s. The air is heavy with coal smoke. Horse dung is everywhere underfoot, and vendors are shouting promises of fresh pies and hot buns. You've got a single penny in your pocket and a belly that feels like it hasn't seen food in days. Every smell seems inviting, every vendor looks convincing, and yet every choice could just as easily land you in a doctor's chair as it could fill your stomach. Take those so-called fresh pies, for example. From the outside, they look golden, flaky, and almost comforting, steam curling up from the crust like a warm invitation. But one bite could tell you another story. Inside, meat was stretched with breadcrumbs, potato peelings, sawdust, or whatever could bulk out a filling that had very little actual beef in it. In hard times, scraps of cat, dog, or even the occasional rat weren't out of the question. The trick was to mask it with gravy so peppery and thick you wouldn't dare ask what the chewy bits actually were, and yet people bought them in droves, not because they believed the lie, but because when you're exhausted after 12 hours in a factory, a warm pie, even a suspicious one, is better than nothing at all. If the pies didn't get you, the candy might. Picture a sweet shop window gleaming with glass jars full of neon-colored drops and lozenges. Children press their faces against the glass, eyes wide, hands sticky from whatever treat they had before. In a city coated in gray soot, these candies looked like jewels, impossibly bright, almost magical. The catch was that the colors came not from fruit but from chemistry's darkest cabinet. Green meant arsenic, yellow came from lead, reds were often laced with mercury. The first bite was sharp and sweet, but the second sometimes left lips tingling, tongues numb, and stomachs twisting. Parents rarely questioned it. If little Tommy fainted or Elsie broke out in a rash, the blame went to the weather, to nerves, or simply to a weak stomach. The doctor, if you could afford him, might hand you brandy and tell you to rest. Meanwhile, kids kept spending their precious pennies for the thrill of sucking on what was essentially a brightly colored dose of poison. And then there was bread, the very foundation of the Victorian diet, and yet one of the most dangerous everyday foods. White bread was the dream, pure, refined, a symbol of prosperity. The problem was that genuine white flour cost more than most could pay, so bakers improvised. They mixed flour with chalk, plaster of Paris, alum, even powdered bones. A loaf could look perfect in the window but crumble into gritty, tooth-breaking reality at home. Doctors even came up with a name for the constant stomach pain it caused: bread belly, which sounds almost quaint until you imagine living with daily cramps from your only staple food. Still, families scraped coins together to buy loaves because something hard and chalky was better than nothing at all, and sharing bread, even bad bread, was still an act of survival. Milk and dairy were no kinder. Imagine the milkman at your door with a smile, handing you a bottle that looks harmless but is already starting to sour. To stretch profits and hide the rot, he's thinned it with water, stirred in chalk, or in some cases splashed in a bit of formaldehyde, the same chemical used to preserve corpses. Butter often carried a blue tint. Cheese sometimes moved on its own thanks to mites or maggots, and ordinary families simply cut away the worst parts and kept eating. Waste was not an option, even if the cheese seemed more alive than you were. Pickled goods offered their own thrills. Eggs, onions, and pigs' feet floated in vinegar so sharp it could strip paint, though vinegar wasn't always vinegar. Sometimes it was just sour beer or spoiled wine, flavored with salt and a sprig of dill. People bit into these snacks with grim determination. On the best days they were tangy, bracing, even satisfying. On the worst days they were mushy, rubbery, or downright lethal. But for a penny you took your chances. For dessert, there was the infamous penny pudding, stale bread mashed with milk of questionable quality, steamed in battered tins and sweetened if you were lucky with treacle or a scattering of dried currants. To children, it was joy in a bowl. To adults, it was just bulk calories disguised as comfort. The texture was often closer to wet plaster than cake, but in a world where hunger was constant, even bad pudding was better than no pudding. And then, of course, came the sausages, cheap, filling, and always suspicious. Sausages were stuffed into intestines cleaned with a quick rinse at best, or else wrapped in cloth or whatever tubular material was available. Inside, you'd find more filler than meat. Breadcrumbs, oats, mashed potato, and scraps of fat spiced heavily to hide the truth. On a good day, they sizzled and filled the air with a delicious aroma. On a bad day, they snapped like parchment and left you running for the privy. Yet still, factory workers and street children clutched them in greasy paper, eating them on the go because in the Victorian world, survival mattered more than flavor. Even seafood carried its risks. Today, oysters are a luxury. Back then, they were the poor man's protein. Vendors sold them fresh from the Thames, shucked on the spot. But the Thames wasn't a river. It was the city's sewer, carrying waste, chemicals, and disease straight into the mouths of anyone brave enough to slurp down a shell. Some lived, some ended up with cholera. But oysters were cheap, and when your stomach was empty, you didn't think about the river. You thought about the salt on your tongue and the protein in your belly. So how did people survive? That's the strangest part. Many didn't. Illness was rampant. Food poisoning was routine. But those who lived through it built stomachs of iron. Children grew up accustomed to strange tingles in their mouths, to bread that crunched with plaster, to candy that glowed with poison. Adults bragged about their ability to down a street pie without consequence, as if resilience itself was a badge of honor. There was pride in being able to eat anything, no matter how suspicious, and walk away still standing. Reform came slowly. Newspapers exposed scandals, arsenic in candy, bones in flour, chalk in milk, and public outrage finally pushed lawmakers toward change. Inspectors began testing food, standards were established, and slowly the roulette wheel of Victorian eating stopped spinning quite so wildly. But until then, every meal was a gamble, every bite a dare, and every penny spent on food came with a whisper of danger. So I'll ask you this. Could you survive a single day eating like a Victorian? Could you stomach a pie that hides more secrets than meat, sip sour milk spiked with chalk, or suck on a candy bright enough to light up a foggy street but dangerous enough to lay you flat? The truth is, maybe you could, but only once. Because what kept Victorians alive wasn't the quality of their food. It was their stubbornness, their desperation, and their strange ability to turn every risk into routine. And that's just the beginning. Because next time, we'll go even deeper into the scandals that rocked Victorian Britain, the shocking stories that finally forced change, and the ways ordinary people balanced joy and danger every time they sat down to eat. Let's pause for a moment and imagine what it must have been like when Victorian newspapers finally started pulling back the curtain on what people were actually eating. Suddenly, The stomach cramps and fevers that families had chalked up to bad air or weak constitutions were being linked to something far more disturbing: the food itself. Scandals splashed across the penny press. Whole classrooms of children collapsing after sharing bright green sweets laced with arsenic. Dozens hospitalized after peppermint lozenges accidentally mixed with poison. Families wasting away from milk preserved with formaldehyde. It sounds like horror fiction, but this was everyday reality. And yet, here's the strange part: people kept buying. They didn't stop eating the pies, the bread, or the candy. Instead, they simply moved to a different stall or crossed their fingers that next time they'd get lucky. Hunger and poverty didn't leave much room for choosiness. Risk was part of the price of survival, and most Victorians had no choice but to gamble with their health at every meal. Journalists did their best to shock the public awake. They described loaves of snow-white bread bulked out with plaster and bone dust. They wrote about pies filled with scraps of fur, cartilage, even the occasional button or coin. They exposed jams that contained almost no fruit at all. Just beet pulp dyed an unnatural crimson with chemical powders. Readers recoiled, they raged, and then they still lined up at the bakery because the alternative was an empty table. That contradiction, that uneasy dance between disgust and necessity, defined Victorian food culture. Still, something began to shift. These exposés planted seeds of reform. Doctors started to notice that children weren't just nervous when they fainted after eating candy, they were being poisoned. Parliament, slow and reluctant, eventually convened committees to investigate food adulteration. Early laws were weak and loosely enforced, but they were the beginning of something revolutionary: the idea that food should not actively try to kill you. Meanwhile, ordinary families developed their own survival strategies. A careful housewife would crack open a loaf and sniff for the telltale chalky smell of plaster. She'd stir milk into hot water to see if a suspicious residue floated on top. Parents would watch their children's lips after eating candy. If they turned blue or green, that was a sign to throw the rest away. These little tricks, passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, became a kind of folk science, a survival handbook in a world where the grocery store doubled as a chemistry experiment. And through all this, people somehow found joy. Children still squealed with delight when their mothers handed them a penny for candy, even knowing that it might come with an upset stomach. Men still bragged in taverns about how many dubious pies they had eaten without falling sick, as though stomach strength was a badge of honor. Resilience wasn't just physical, it was cultural. In a city choking with smog and sickness, laughter, bravado, and stubbornness were as important as bread. Looking back now, it's easy to shake our heads at how reckless it all seems. But here's the truth. Without those hard lessons, without those scandals and tragedies, we might never have developed modern food safety. Every arsenic-laced bonbon, every plaster-filled loaf, every scandalous pie forced society a little closer toward demanding protections that today we take for granted. In a way, the pain of the Victorians bought us the peace of mind we have when we open a carton of milk or unwrap a candy bar without fear. So let me ask you, if you were dropped into London in 1855 with just one coin in your pocket, what would you risk it on? A crust of chalky bread, a meat pie of unknown origin, or a candy glowing brighter than any fruit in nature? It almost doesn't matter, because no matter what you chose, it was always a gamble. But if you survived, Well, at least you'd walk away with a story to tell, and in Victorian England, that was worth almost as much as the meal itself. Now picture this. You've made it through the factory shift or the morning errands, and the smell of sugar and frying fat drifts through the fog. That can only mean one thing. The fair is in town. And if you think food was a gamble on the streets, wait until you step into a Victorian fairground where every treat is both a promise and a dare. The air is alive with music from wheezy organs, shouts from barkers, and the metallic rattle of coin against tin. Children tug at sleeves, their eyes locked on towering racks of toffee apples gleaming like jewels. From a distance, they look magical, red, glossy, perfect. But the first bite is like biting into a sugar-coated brick. The hardened shell cracks into shards sharp enough to cut your gums, and the apple beneath is cold, mealy, and sometimes sour enough to make your eyes water. Still, compared to porridge or bread with chalk dust, even a bruised apple wrapped in sugar was heaven. Not far from the candy stalls, another vendor shouts over the chaos, hawking fried dough. The smell is irresistible, golden, sweet, and warm. You hand over your coin and receive a fritter dripping with oil, dusted with sugar. But one bite tells the truth. The outside is crisp, but the inside is raw, chewy, and oozing with grease. Some fritters were so heavy that they sat in your stomach like stones. Others were hollow, nothing more than a puff of fried air pretending to be food. And yet people lined up for more because the illusion of indulgence was almost as satisfying as the food itself. Then there was the real showstopper, fairground candy floss, what they called fairy floss in the day. Thin threads of spun sugar catching the lamplight, clinging to fingers, sticking in your hair, melting on your tongue like a dream. It looked delicate, but in truth it was often spun from sugar cut with starch or chalk, anything white enough to bulk up the seller's supply. One gust of wind and your treat might taste more of soot than sweetness. Still, children adored it. In a world where sweetness was rare, even sticky chalk dust wrapped around a stick felt like luxury. Of course, no fairground would be complete without something savory. Sausages sizzled on open grills, sending smoke curling into the night sky. The smell was mouth-watering, but the recipe was anyone's guess. Half meat, half mystery, and all risk. Maybe it was pork. Maybe it was last week's scraps dressed up with spice. Some sausage rolls were legendary, fat, juicy, and satisfying. Others, well, let's just say the bravest Victorians bit into them without asking too many questions. And yet, the fairground wasn't just about food. It was about escape. For one evening, factory workers, chimney sweeps, and shop girls could forget the grind of survival. They could laugh, eat, and walk home with sticky fingers and aching bellies, telling themselves that the night was worth the gamble. Because in Victorian England, even joy came laced with danger, and even dessert carried a risk. So, as you leave the fairground, stomach rumbling, lips sticky, and coins spent, you realize something. Nobody here eats for health or safety, or even flavor. They eat for the thrill, the fleeting illusion of sweetness, the simple act of holding something warm in their hands. And maybe that's the real story of Victorian junk food. It wasn't about what it gave you, but about what it let you forget. If the fairground was reckless fun for adults, then childhood snacking in Victorian England was its own brand of dangerous adventure. Imagine a group of soot-smudged kids huddled around a street cart, their eyes wide and their pennies clutched tight like treasure. What do they buy? Candy, of course. Not the kind you'd recognize today. No chocolate bars in bright wrappers, no gummy bears, no Skittles. These were hard little lumps of sugar, colored so brightly they looked like jewels pulled from a dragon's cave. Bullseyes, acid drops, sugar mice, licorice pipes, all sold loose, scooped out by hand from open jars into crumpled paper twists, and whose hands were doing the scooping. The same ones that just handled dirty coins, patted a stray dog, or wiped down the stall with an apron stained by yesterday's stew. Hygiene wasn't even in the vocabulary. But did the kids care? Not a bit. They were too busy arguing over whose tongue was the brightest shade of green or daring each other to crunch straight through a jawbreaker that could chip a tooth. The truth was, sugar was expensive, so candy makers stretched it with whatever they could get away with. Chalk, plaster of Paris, even powdered glass for that satisfying crunch. If you got a bullseye with actual peppermint flavor, you counted yourself lucky. More often, it tasted faintly of limestone and left grit between your teeth. Licorice was another favorite, chewy and sweet, unless you bought from the bottom of the barrel, where the pipes had fused into a single black brick flavored mostly by thyme and dust. Still, for Victorian children, these treats were magic. Imagine growing up with porridge every morning, bread and dripping most days, maybe a boiled potato at night. Then suddenly, you've got a coin in your pocket and the chance to buy something dazzling, something forbidden. Candy wasn't just sugar. It was color, it was bragging rights. It was a chance to forget hunger for a few sweet minutes, even if it came with a side order of stomach cramps. And then there were the foraged snacks. Hedge berries no one could quite name, but everyone swore were safe, probably. Roasted chestnuts when winter rolled in, their smoky sweetness making cold nights bearable. A slice of bread with dripping, or if you were really lucky, a smear of jam so red it looked like bottled sunlight. Of course, that jam might be beet pulp dyed with lead oxide, but kids didn't know and parents didn't ask. Every sweet was a gamble, every bite a lesson. Sometimes the lesson was grit between your teeth. Sometimes it was a night curled up with stomach pains, and sometimes, if you were lucky, it was nothing more than sticky fingers and a sugar rush. Childhood in Victorian London wasn't gentle, but it had its joys. And in the end, the real sweetness wasn't the candy at all. It was the chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with your friends, to dream about one day buying a whole jar, and to laugh in the face of risk because, honestly, what else was childhood for? Step inside a Victorian corner shop and you'll see shelves stacked high with tins, jars, and bottles that promise modern convenience. But in truth, each one is a roll of the dice with your stomach. Preserved goods were the pride of the industrial age, proof that science could tame food. But science in those days still came with a wink and a prayer. Let's start with canned food, the miracle of the century. The idea was simple: cook meat or fruit, seal it tight, and keep out the air. Sounds safe enough, right? But these were no sleek little cans with neat pull tabs. They were heavy, handmade, clumsy things, soldered shut with generous blobs of lead. Yes, lead. Every time you picked up a tin, you were holding both dinner and poison in one neat package. And opening one, that was half the drama. No can opener, no neat pop. Just you, a knife, and the silent hope that whatever was inside wouldn't explode across the kitchen like a Jackson Pollock made of gravy. Sometimes the lid hissed, releasing a faint metallic tang. Other times it bulged ominously, before surrendering with a spray of fermented stew. Inside you might find fruit swimming in syrup so thick it could patch a wall, or beef so spongy it looked more like upholstery stuffing than food. Even worse were the surprises. A lump of something grayish that may once have been meat. a plum that glowed faintly from the chemical preservatives, or that faint fizz, always the warning sign of botulism lurking in the shadows. Yet people bought tins eagerly, because the promise was too powerful. Strawberries in December, beef in a house that had never seen a cow, a pudding that lasted until next Christmas. Then there were the preserves in jars. Plums, cherries, gooseberries, all glistening in thick syrup under wax seals or cloth tied with string. They looked beautiful, jewel-like in the lamplight, but peer closer and you might spot movement. Fruit flies or beetles, tiny black specks wriggling between the cherries. Mothers strained them out, sighed, and served dessert anyway. Extra protein, they said with a shrug. Waste not, want not. Pickles and chutneys weren't much better. A jar of onions or cabbage bobbing in sharp vinegar was a staple on poor tables, but the vinegar wasn't always vinegar. Sometimes it was soured beer, sometimes old wine doctored with chemicals for extra color. If you bit into a pickle that crunched, you couldn't be sure whether it was the cucumber or the copper sulfate. Still, preserved food was a miracle for Victorians. It meant a taste of summer in the middle of winter. It meant calories when fresh food was gone. And yes, it meant risk, serious, sometimes deadly risk. But they accepted it. Every tin was opened with equal parts excitement and dread. Every jar was a gamble between flavor and food poisoning. And isn't that the essence of Victorian junk food? Hope, hunger, and a willingness to eat something you probably shouldn't. Families told horror stories, exploding tins at Christmas, glowing salmon at picnics, puddings that literally buzzed when cut. But they still lined up at the shop the next week, coins ready because what else could they do? So you sit at your table, spoon hovering over a slice of tinned ham, a smear of jam that glitters just a little too red, a pickle that bites back harder than you expected. You chew, you swallow, you pray, and you keep going. Because in Victorian England, survival wasn't about eating well. It was about eating at all. Picture a Victorian breakfast table. The tea is weak, the bread is chalky, and sitting proudly in the middle is a jar of jam so red it practically glows. For a moment, you allow yourself to dream. Sweet strawberries, ripe raspberries, a spoonful of summer spread on a crust of bread. But one taste reminds you, this is not strawberries. This is science. Victorian jam was a masterpiece of illusion. Real berries were far too expensive to waste on ordinary families. So grocers and jam makers turned to apple cores, beet pulp, and sugar when they could afford it. Apple scraps gave body, beet pulp gave color, and when that wasn't enough, there was always the chemist's shelf. A splash of coal tar dye for brilliance, a pinch of red lead for sheen, maybe even a little alum to thicken the mess. The result? Jam that looked like jewels but tasted like betrayal. Spread it on your bread and you'd notice the grit. Not seeds, though you might find one or two if you were lucky, but fragments of wood, string, or whatever fell into the vat when no one was looking. Jam jars often doubled as garbage bins for leftovers from the fruit press. And that brilliant red shine, it wasn't nature, it was chemistry, the same chemicals used to dye fabrics and wallpaper. The texture was another giveaway. Sometimes stringy, sometimes lumpy, sometimes closer to glue than jam. A child might still lick their spoon and smile because sugar, real or fake, was rare enough to feel like a treasure. But parents knew better. After all, everyone had heard the stories. Children breaking out in rashes, neighbors falling ill, doctors muttering about nervous temperament when the truth was simply lead oxide in their morning toast. And yet, jam was beloved. A gray London morning could be transformed by a spoonful of fake strawberry. A birthday cake, even if baked from plaster-filled flour, looked festive when topped with a smear of crimson jelly. Adults hoarded jars, children begged for them, and grocers made a killing selling illusions. The occasional scandal hit the papers. Jars discovered with almost no fruit at all, or worse, with objects that weren't even food. But regulation was weak, and hunger was stronger. Families kept buying, kept spreading, kept pretending. Because when your days are filled with porridge and hard bread, even a hint of sweetness feels like a miracle, even if it comes with a side of poison. So you finish your slice of bread, teeth aching from the sugar, lips stained red like you've kissed a ghost. You tell yourself it's fruit. You tell your children it's fruit, and maybe, just maybe, for one bright bite, it almost feels true. Now let's step away from jam jars and take a cautious look at another staple of Victorian life, cheese. But not the kind you slice neatly onto crackers at a modern wine night. No, Victorian cheese was a world of mystery, microbes, and sheer intestinal bravery. Walk into a corner grocer's shop in 1880s London, and you'd be greeted not by a pleasant dairy counter, but by a wall of scent so strong it could curl wallpaper. Wheels of cheddar, Stilton, and local specials sat in the damp cellar, aging on planks that doubled as mouse highways. There was no refrigeration, no sterile wrapping, just wood, cloth, and time. And time in Victorian London was not your friend. A wedge of cheese could be smooth, crumbly, or crawling. Mold wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Blue veins streaked boldly through the cheese, giving it a sharp, biting tang. Some customers swore the mold was what made it safe. Others simply carved around it and hoped for the best. If you got a chunk with bonus textures, say a bit of grit or a stray hair, well, that was just part of the deal. And then there was mite cheese. Yes, you heard that right. Certain cheeses were deliberately colonized by tiny, almost invisible mites that gnawed through the rind, leaving behind a powdery surface and a smell that could clear a room. Brave souls ate it as proof of toughness, while the more squeamish sliced deep, searching for safer territory beneath the surface. Of course, where there were mites, there were often maggots. A wheel left too long in the cellar could start moving on its own, wriggling with life. And still, waste was unthinkable. Families scraped, sliced, or cut around the squirming bits and slapped the rest onto bread. Protein was protein even if it stared back at you. The preservatives didn't help either. When salt was scarce, grocers dusted their cheeses with preserving powder, a mysterious blend that could include alum, borax, or whatever was cheapest that week. It gave the rind a sharp, chemical tang and more than a few stomach cramps. But again, this was normal. Nobody expected food to be safe. They only expected it to fill the belly. And yet, despite the mold, mites, and questionable chemistry, cheese was loved. It was hearty, it was fat-rich, and it made even chalky bread taste like a meal. Children begged for it, wrinkling their noses but sneaking bites anyway. Adults paired it with ale, called it supper, and carried on. Cheese was memory, tradition, and dare rolled into one. So you chew your slice of Victorian cheddar, eyes watering, mouth tingling, and tell yourself it's delicious. Because in this world, survival meant convincing yourself that flavor was just another word for fortitude. Now let's wander over to something that looks safe, something you'd think even Victorians couldn't ruin: fruit. A shiny apple, a pear, maybe some berries. How bad could it be? But in Victorian London, even fruit came with a catch. Picture the street stalls on a foggy afternoon. Baskets of apples are piled high, their skins gleaming like they've just been polished for a royal parade. They look perfect, too perfect. And that's because they were. Vendors weren't waxing fruit with anything natural. Instead, many polished them with toxic compounds like lead-based powders or copper salts, chemicals borrowed from the paint shop next door. The result, fruit that sparkled like jewelry, but carried the kind of shine you probably didn't want in your stomach. An unsuspecting child might hand over a penny for the brightest apple on the cart, take one proud bite, and wonder why their tongue went a little numb. Shoppers noticed, of course, but when you were living hand-to-mouth, appearance sold faster than safety. If it looked healthy, people believed it was. And then there was freshness, or rather, the lack of it. Most fresh fruit had been sitting in damp cellars for weeks, sometimes months. By the time it hit the stall, it might already be halfway to cider. Rotten spots were carefully hidden under leaves and bruises were turned toward the bottom of the basket. A vendor's smile was as important as the produce itself, because sometimes charm had to sell what the fruit couldn't. Oranges, a rare treat, were often reused. Once a wealthy customer peeled theirs, a quick-thinking vendor might scoop up the discarded rind, reassemble it around scraps of pulp, and sell it again to a poorer buyer. Grapes were padded with water to look plump, though the liquid inside was usually more swamp than vineyard. And yet, fruit was irresistible. In a city of grays and browns, gray bread, brown stews, dull porridge, fruit offered a burst of color and hope. A gleaming apple, even if polished with poison, symbolized vitality. Mothers would hand them to their children with a sigh of relief, telling themselves it was wholesome. Kids would bite into them, juice dripping down their chins, never realizing they just chewed on a chemical experiment. So next time you complain about your slightly mealy grocery store apple, think of the Victorian street fruit. In that world, every bite was a gamble, and every shiny apple was both a promise and a threat. Step inside a greasy Victorian eatery, what they called a chop house, or a coffee shop. Though you'd be hard-pressed to find either chops or actual coffee worth drinking, these were the haunts of dock workers, laborers, and anyone desperate for a hot plate, no matter the risks. The moment you push open the door, you're hit with a wall of steam, grease, and cabbage boiled beyond recognition. The windows are slick with condensation, tables wobble with every touch, and the air smells like lard, vinegar, and faint despair. It's crowded, noisy, and alive with the clatter of spoons against chipped bowls. You're not here for pleasure, you're here for calories. On the chalkboard menu, today's special stew is listed optimistically as mutton. In reality, it could be anything. Perhaps some stringy scraps salvaged from a butcher's bin, padded with turnips and thickened with flour until it clings to your spoon like glue. The surface gleams with a rainbow slick of fat, the kind that makes you wonder how many animals and how many days went into that pot. Cutlery is whatever the last customer left behind, given a rinse in tepid water and a half-hearted wipe. The spoons are bent, the forks dull, but nobody complains. At a penny or two a bowl, you can't afford to be picky. Bread comes on the side, hard as stone, sometimes reused from yesterday's tables, sometimes reheated over a coal fire just long enough to seem fresh. If you're lucky, it only tastes stale. If you're not, it comes with a surprise swirl of mold inside. Flies hover shamelessly over the tables, sometimes landing in your food before you even lift the spoon. The cook doesn't mind. He's too busy ladling stew and wiping his hands on an apron that hasn't seen soap in months. Hygiene is a rumor here, not a rule. And yet, There's a strange comfort in it. You share the space with fellow workers slurping their meals in weary silence, nodding to each other with the unspoken bond of survival. For a brief moment, everyone is warm, full, and united in the gamble of eating whatever was cheapest that morning. You finish your bowl, mop up the last greasy streak with bread, and ignore the faint crunch of grit between your teeth. Was it meat? Was it bone? Was it plaster? No one asks. You simply pay your penny, step back into the foggy street, and thank your stomach for holding out, at least for now. Because in Victorian London, dining out wasn't indulgence. It was an act of faith. The bell of the pie man rings through the foggy London street like a promise and a threat all at once. People rush toward the cart, coins clutched in cold hands, because nothing fills a belly faster than a hot pie. But everyone knows, deep down, that these pies are more gamble than guarantee. The crust is golden, flaky, glistening under the dim glow of the gas lamps. It smells like comfort, like home, like something your grandmother might have baked, if your grandmother was willing to sweep scraps off the butcher's floor and stuff them under pastry. You hand over your penny, and in return, you cradle a steaming, palm-sized meal. The first bite is always bliss. The crust is crisp, buttery, salty. You think maybe this time you've lucked out, but then your teeth sink into the filling and reality sets in. It's chewy, stringy, and peppered with mystery. Something gelatinous clings to your tongue. There's gravy, sure, but it's suspiciously thick, almost paste-like, and seasoned heavily with pepper to cover whatever it's hiding. Let's be honest. Pie men were artists of illusion. Beef, mutton, chicken. These were the promises painted on the cart. But what you actually got might be rat, cat, or even a scrap of old leather softened in broth. Feet, head, sinew, offal, all minced, boiled, and seasoned until they could be passed off as meat. Rumors told of buttons, feathers, and even the occasional tooth tucked inside. And those weren't always rumors. The crust wasn't much safer. Flour was expensive, so bakers stretched it with sawdust, chalk, or bone dust. If your pie had a crunch, it wasn't because it was flaky. It was because you'd bitten into the workshop floor. For shine, vendors brushed the crust with lard mixed with dye, or in some cases, whatever liquid was lying around. It gleamed beautifully, but it was a con man's smile, bright on the outside, dubious within. And yet people lined up every day. Why? Because the pies were hot, filling, and portable. When you've just finished 12 hours in a factory, you don't ask questions. You just want food in your hands and something warm in your stomach. It didn't matter if the filling was more pepper than protein. Hunger makes optimists of us all. So you finish your pie, wiping grease from your lips and pushing down the unease curling in your gut. Did you just eat beef? Or did you just consume history's most mysterious mystery meat? No one can say for sure. All you know is that you're still standing, still moving, and still hungry for tomorrow. Because in Victorian London, pies weren't just food. They were survival dressed in pastry. The smell hits you before you even see the stall. A mix of brine, vinegar, and something far less poetic. Low tide mixed with city runoff. This is the Victorian fish shop, or more often, the riverside oyster cart. And here's the truth. Oysters in the 1800s weren't a luxury food for the wealthy. They were the cheapest protein you could buy, sold by the dozen for less than the price of bread. The oyster man stands by his baskets, shucking shells with a knife that's been through more hands than a deck of cards in a gambling den. Around him, Londoners from every class gather, ragged urchins, soot-covered laborers, and even clerks in bowler hats, all united by the same reckless optimism. Maybe this oyster won't kill me, but freshness, that was a matter of faith. These oysters came straight from the River Thames, which by mid-century had turned into an open sewer. Industrial runoff, animal waste, and human waste all flowed into the same waters where shellfish thrived. The river was alive, yes, but not with anything you wanted near your dinner plate. Cholera and typhoid stalked the riverbanks as faithfully as the gulls. Still, people slurped them down. The oyster man might squirt a little vinegar or shake some pepper to dress them up, but no amount of seasoning could disguise the gamble. One oyster might taste like the sea, the next might taste like the river itself, and leave you sprinting to the privy by sundown. And yet, oysters weren't just food, they were ritual. Couples courted over them, friends toasted with beer while swallowing them whole, and workers marked paydays with a dozen oysters and a pint of ale. Eating them was a dare, a test of toughness, and a badge of belonging to the great, grimy city. Of course, oysters weren't the only shellfish on offer. Cockles, whelks, and mussels filled paper cones sold by the pint. Some were soft, some crunchy, and some suspiciously alive even after hitting your tongue. A brave eater would wash them down with warm beer, reasoning that alcohol might kill whatever the river didn't. Doctors warned against eating shellfish in hot weather, but Londoners shrugged. Life was already full of danger. What was one more? A night of fever or stomach cramps was the price of admission to the Victorian food scene. And if you survived, you earned bragging rights. So you tilt your head back, swallow your oyster, and feel that cold, slippery slide down your throat. Maybe it was fine. Maybe it was your last mistake. Either way, you've joined the chorus of millions who risked their guts for a cheap bite of protein on the Thames. Because in Victorian London, even the river had teeth. Picture this for a moment. You're sitting at a wooden table in a dim little kitchen, a single candle guttering in the draft, the walls damp with London fog. Outside, a cart rattles past, vendors shouting about pies and pickles, the sound carrying through thin windows. Your family gathers close, shoulders brushing, and dinner is served. But instead of comfort, it's a bowl of soup so thin you can see the bottom, with floating scraps you're not sure are vegetables or just illusions. This was life for so many Victorians. Meals weren't about taste. They were about stretching the little you had until it filled a pot. Bread crusts softened in hot water became broth. Bones simmered for hours flavored the water with just enough meatiness to trick the senses. And when there wasn't even that, people leaned on imagination, calling it stew when it was little more than boiled cabbage and hope. And yet, even here in this bleakness, you'd hear laughter. Children slurping, mothers scolding them gently for spilling, fathers cracking jokes about how tomorrow's soup might be thicker if the neighbor's cat strayed too close. Humor was survival too, as much as food was. Think about it. How many of us today would sit down at a table like that and still find a reason to smile? The Victorians did because they had to. They carried on, not because the food was safe or nourishing, but because the act of eating together kept them human in a world that often tried to strip that away. And maybe that's the lesson hidden under all this soot and spoiled milk. Food is memory. Food is connection. Even when it's bad, maybe especially when it's bad, it binds people together. When you've survived a day of questionable oysters, chalk bread, or pies with mystery fillings, you laugh not because it's funny, but because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So tonight, as you think about your next meal, take a moment of gratitude. Your bread is soft. Your milk is safe. Your candy won't send you to the apothecary. That's not just progress. It's a luxury your ancestors could never have dreamed of. And yet, the thread between us and them remains. We still gather at tables, we still share meals, and we still tell stories about what we ate. That's how people endure. Not with perfect food, but with imperfect moments made beautiful by company, resilience, and the simple act of keeping on. Close your eyes and picture that Victorian family, huddled over their soup, whispering jokes into the steam, sharing crumbs as if they were feasts. If they could find joy in that, maybe we can find joy in anything. Hey guys, let's step back out of the kitchen and onto the street again, because if there's one thing the Victorians never lacked, it was the temptation of food stalls promising quick comfort. Imagine you're walking through a London alley at dusk. Gas lamps flicker. The fog curls low, carrying the smell of frying fat, vinegar, and something fishy that may or may not be legal to sell. There's a pie man calling out, balancing trays of steaming pastries. Kids dart between carts, clutching pennies, their eyes locked on jars of bright candies that look more like jewels than food. And somewhere, a woman is stirring a pot of eel stew so thick it clings to the ladle like glue. You're hungry, you know the risks, but hunger doesn't wait for safety. That was the daily gamble. Would tonight's supper fill you up, or would it leave you doubled over on the floorboards by midnight? And yet people bought, ate, and returned the next day. Why? Because cheap, hot food was life. It was energy to get through a 12-hour factory shift. It was a small pleasure in a city that often gave people very little to smile about. And the strange thing is, even though we shake our heads at their diets, chalk bread, arsenic sweets, milk laced with formaldehyde, there's something familiar here. Haven't we all eaten something we knew wasn't good for us just because it was quick, or cheap, or comforting? Fast food today may not come with rat pies or glowing bonbons, but the spirit is the same. Sometimes survival isn't about perfect health. It's about grabbing what you can when you can and keeping on moving. But think of the resilience it built. Children grew up strong not because the food nourished them, but because their bodies learned to fight back against whatever they swallowed. Adults carried iron stomachs and even stronger humor, turning their meals into running jokes. Was that beef or button leather? Don't worry, the pepper will hide it. Laughter was a seasoning too, one that never ran out. Now picture this. You're standing at a street corner, a meat pie warm in your hands, steam rising against the chill night. You know it's risky, but for that one moment it feels like comfort. The crowd hums around you, the city groans, and you take a bite. Flaky, greasy, questionable, but it's yours. That was Victorian junk food. A little danger, a little delight, and a whole lot of grit. And maybe that's why their story still grips us today. Because eating back then wasn't just about food. It was about courage, community, and finding scraps of joy in a hard world. So as you sit in your safe kitchen tonight, maybe with a sandwich or a bag of chips, remember the people who came before. They taught us that even the most dangerous meal could carry a little bit of comfort, and that the act of eating together, even when the food was half poison, was still worth it. Hey guys, let's wander deeper into the maze of Victorian markets, because if the pies were a gamble, the fish stalls were downright Russian roulette. Picture the Thames on a hot afternoon, its waters thick with smoke, sewage, and secrets. And right along the riverbank, vendors with baskets brimming over with oysters, cockles, and mussels, cheap, plentiful, and only sometimes edible. You lean in. The oyster man pries open a shell with his knife, flicks it toward you, and with a grin that dares you to refuse, says, "Fresh this morning." You don't ask fresh from where, you already know. Fresh from the same river where half the city dumps its waste. But oysters are everywhere, the food of the people, sold by the dozen for the price of a loaf. and so you tip your head back and let it slide down. Briny, metallic, alive in ways you'd rather not think about. If it doesn't make you sick, you'll tell your friends it was the best you've ever had. If it does, well, chalk it up as part of the risk. Victorian Londoners didn't just eat fish, they celebrated it. Eel pies were iconic, their gelatinous gravy sticking to spoons and teeth with equal persistence. Pickled whelks floated in jars so cloudy you weren't sure if it was vinegar or just time doing its work. Whitebait fried in handfuls was sold to children like popcorn, though sometimes it was hard to tell if the crunch was bone, sand, or something else entirely. And the funny part, people loved it. They didn't just eat it, they lined up for it. Because protein was protein, and fish, even suspicious fish, kept you alive another day. Of course, the dangers were legendary. Outbreaks of cholera linked to oysters, fevers that swept through boarding houses after a bad batch of shrimp, whole families laid low by summer complaint, which was really just food poisoning dressed up in a polite name. But warnings never stopped the crowds. Cheap food was worth the risk, and besides, everyone believed beer could disinfect anything. Wash it down with ale and maybe you'd be fine. And yet there's a strange beauty in this chaos. Imagine the scene. Gas lamps glowing against the fog, children clutching paper cones of cockles, workers laughing over greasy eel pies, and the river glimmering dark and dangerous behind them. It's not just food, it's survival, community, defiance. To eat in Victorian London was to gamble with your health and still smile while you did it. Maybe that's why the stories of their junk food linger, because under all the grime and risk, there's resilience. These were people who knew life was short, hard, and unpredictable. So when they bit into a glowing sweet or slurped down a questionable oyster, they weren't just eating, they were daring fate. And as you think about it, doesn't that feel oddly familiar? Today we've got neon-colored sodas, fast food burgers that never rot, and snacks that glow under blacklight. Maybe we're not so far from them after all. The difference is, we get to read the labels first. So now that we've braved the riverside oysters and eel pies, let's wander where Victorian food gets its most deceptive makeover, the fairground. Picture it. The air is thick with smoke, laughter, and the shrieks of children darting from one stall to the next. The scent of sugar, grease, and horse manure blends into something bizarrely festive. This is where food isn't just about survival, it's about spectacle. You see the toffee apples first, dangling from sticks like jeweled ornaments. They glisten under gaslight, sugar hardened into a glossy amber shell. You hand over your penny, bite in, and instantly regret it. The candy cracks like glass, sharp enough to cut your gums, while the apple underneath tastes like it's been in a cellar since Christmas. Sweetness, pain, and disappointment all in one bite. Welcome to dessert Victorian style. Then there's the fried dough. Every stall claims theirs is the best, tossing lumps of batter into vats of lard that's seen more reuse than your uncle's shaving water. They come out golden and steaming, dusted with sugar that might just be powdered chalk. The first bite can be glorious, warm, and indulgent. The second bite, suddenly you're wondering if your teeth will ever forgive you. Sometimes the inside is raw, gooey, and undercooked. Sometimes it's a hollow shell of grease. Either way, you're chewing your way through a dare disguised as a treat. And no fairground is complete without candy floss. Cotton candy, the Victorians' pastel dream. Wisps of spun sugar clung to every child's fingers and face, picking up the dust and soot of the city air as they twirled. Imagine a cloud of pink and blue sugar melting on your tongue along with whatever the wind decided to carry past that day. But it didn't matter. Kids adored it. It was sticky joy in its purest form, even if it stuck to everything within 5 feet. Of course, not all sweets were innocent. Color was king in Victorian England, and if a treat didn't glow like a tropical bird, no one wanted it. That's how you ended up with candies laced with arsenic for green, lead for yellow, and copper for blue. A jar of green bonbons in a shop window was more than candy. It was temptation incarnate, dangerous and dazzling. Children pressed their noses to the glass, begging for pennies, while mothers, half aware of the risk, gave in anyway. 1 bite meant delight. 2 bites might mean dizziness. 3, well, let's just say the chemist made a good living. And yet the fairground was magical. For families who worked 12-hour days in factories, who ate bread hard as bricks and porridge gray as stone, this chaos of fried dough, candied apples, and glowing sweets was a taste of wonder. It was escape. Maybe you'd spend the night doubled over, maybe you wouldn't. But for a brief, sugary moment, you felt rich. That's the thing about Victorian junk food. It wasn't just about calories. It was about hope. Hope wrapped in sugar, fried in lard, or floating in vinegar. Hope that for once, food could taste like joy instead of survival. And even if it bit back later, it was worth it. Now, if you thought the fairground was wild, wait until you step into the world of Victorian childhood snacks. Because if adults were gambling with their stomachs, children were practically professional daredevils. Picture a knot of kids in threadbare clothes, crowding around a sweet cart on a soot-stained street corner. Their faces are pressed to the wooden counter, their eyes wide, their pennies clutched in dirty fists. The shopkeeper dips a grubby hand into jars of candies that glow in impossible colors: emerald, ruby, cobalt blue. It's not just sugar, it's temptation you can chew. For half a penny, you might get a handful of bull's eyes, peppermint candies with a crunch that sometimes came from chalk or sand more than sugar. Licorice pipes were another favorite, chewy and jet black, made with industrial dyes so strong they could stain your teeth for days. And then there were the acid drops, sharp enough to strip the lining off your tongue. Kids dared each other to bite straight through a bull's eye or crunch down on a jawbreaker, their bravery measured in broken teeth and stomach aches. And oh, the Turkish delight. Sticky cubes rolled in sugar, handed out in greasy paper twists, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter, sometimes flavored with rose water, and sometimes flavored with whatever dust had been floating around the shop that morning. But who cared? It was candy. It was color. It was magic in a world of gray bread and cabbage. Hygiene, forget it. The same hands that scooped your sweets had just handled coins, stroked a stray dog, maybe wiped sweat from a brow. Did that stop children? Not for a second. They popped the candy into their mouths, tongues turning neon green, red, or blue, showing them off proudly like trophies. The brighter your tongue, the braver you were. And then there were the true budget snacks. A roasted chestnut in winter if you were lucky. A slice of bread spread thinly with dripping if your family had saved any from Sunday's roast. Or a scrap of foraged fruit, maybe an apple if fortune smiled. Maybe hedge berries that no one could name but everyone swore wouldn't kill you, probably. For Victorian kids, candy wasn't just food. It was currency, it was status. It was a way to forget hunger for a few sweet, dangerous moments. They traded sweets, bragged about who had the brightest tongue, and dreamed of the day they'd be rich enough to buy a whole jar. And yes, sometimes that dream ended with a stomach ache or worse. But in a childhood full of chores, cold mornings, and strict rules, that one bite of color was worth every risk. If candy was the gamble of childhood, preserved goods were the gamble of adulthood. You see, in the 19th century, long shelf life didn't mean safe. It meant mysterious. Walk into a Victorian corner shop, and the shelves were lined with tins, jars, and bottles that looked reassuringly modern. But once you opened them, it was anyone's guess whether you were about to enjoy a miracle or unleash a disaster. Take canned food, for instance, the pride of Victorian innovation. Seal meat or fruit inside a heavy tin, solder it shut with a generous dollop of lead, and voila, dinner in a box. It sounded revolutionary, and in theory it was, except the tins rusted, bulged, and sometimes hissed ominously before exploding across your kitchen. Inside, meat that had dissolved into spongy gray mush, fruit floating in syrup thicker than glue or worse, something so unrecognizable you couldn't even decide if it had once been alive. Then there was the metallic tang. Every bite carried the ghost of the tin itself, a reminder that you were chewing on both food and hardware. And if you were really unlucky, botulism, that invisible, silent killer that could turn a family meal into a wake. Yet still, people bought them, because in the dead of winter, when the markets were bare, that tin of peaches, bugs and all, was a glimpse of summer. And it wasn't just cans. Preserved fruits were kept in wax-sealed jars, looking oh so inviting on the outside. Plums, cherries, currants swimming in syrup, but stir too deep, and you might find weevils, beetles, or fruit flies who had been dining there long before you. Victorian housewives tried straining them out, but a little crunch in your jam was considered part of the experience. Extra protein, they joke grimly, carving away the worst bits and carrying on. Pickles and chutneys weren't much better. The vinegar was sharp enough to pickle your insides, and the vegetables inside were often scraps sliced paper thin to stretch them. Labels told you nothing. Expiration dates didn't exist. The best before test was simply sniff it, poke it, and pray. Every family had a horror story. A plum pudding ruined by a can that popped like a grenade. A picnic where the tinned salmon glowed faintly in the dark, or a fruitcake that buzzed, literally, when sliced. Yet people kept buying preserved goods. Why? Because in a world where famine was never far away, a jar of jam or a tin of beef stew was a promise. A dangerous, unpredictable promise, but a promise all the same. And sometimes, against all odds, the gamble paid off. You'd crack open a tin, and inside was something fresh, flavorful, and even delightful. For those rare moments, it felt like progress, like the future had finally arrived. You'd spread cherry preserves on bread, spear a pickle with your knife, and raise your fork in salute to human stubbornness. Because yes, it might kill you, but tonight it kept you full. Now let's talk about jam. Sweet, jewel-toned, seemingly harmless jam. On the Victorian breakfast table, it looked like a blessing. A bright jar of ruby red preserves to spread on your otherwise chalk-filled bread. The sight alone could lift a weary spirit. But here's the trick. Most of that strawberry jam had never even met a strawberry. Instead, it was a magician's act with food. Apple cores, beet pulp, and water made up the bulk of it. Then came the chemistry, dyes so harsh they could stain your hands for days. Carmine if you were lucky, lead oxide if you weren't. The result? A jam so vividly red it looked more like a warning sign than a breakfast spread. It gleamed in the jar, a glossy promise of fruit that never arrived. The first taste told the real story. Gritty, stringy, cloyingly sweet, with an aftertaste that lingered like regret. Sometimes you'd find a chunk that might have been a berry, or it might have been something that fell in during stirring. String from the jam pan may be a splinter of wood, and if the label proudly claimed with fruit pieces, well, you learn not to ask what kind of fruit. Children begged for it anyway, their tongues stained red, their bellies aching, their mothers brushing off rashes as nervous temperaments. Doctors, meanwhile, blamed weak constitutions instead of the bucket of beetroot and dye that just passed for breakfast. The unlucky ended up at the apothecary, prescribed nothing more than weak tea, dry toast, and a polite shrug. But jam wasn't just food, it was a little illusion of luxury. In a gray, hungry city, it brought color. Families would huddle around the table, passing the jar like treasure. On rare days when you tasted actual strawberry, the shock was almost too much. The real fruit was soft, fragrant, unmistakably alive compared to the ghostly sweetness Victorians were used to. Everyone knew it was a gamble. Neighbors swapped rumors about which grocer's jam had the least strange aftertaste, which one didn't leave your lips tingling. But nobody gave it up completely. Because in a world of chalky bread and sour milk, jam was joy, dangerous, artificial joy, but joy all the same. So you'd smear another spoonful, close your eyes, and pretend. Pretend you were tasting summer, not chemistry. Pretend the grit between your teeth was just seeds, not plaster. Pretend this breakfast was normal. In the end, that's what Victorian junk food was all about. Not nourishment, not safety, but the sheer human ability to swallow risk with a smile and call it sweetness. If jam was an illusion, cheese was a gamble. Walk into a Victorian grocer's shop and you'd know right away. You could smell it before you even saw it. Wheels of cheddar, wedges of Stilton, and odd local specialties sat stacked on rough wooden planks that doubled as shelves, cutting boards, and let's be honest, highways for mice. The air was damp, sour, and thick with the kind of odor that clung to your clothes long after you left. Cheese in the 19th century wasn't just food. It was a living, breathing ecosystem. Mold wasn't the enemy. It was practically an ingredient. Blue veins ran like rivers through wedges, sometimes sharp and flavorful, sometimes stinging your nose with a medicinal tang that made you question your choices. And if you were truly unlucky, you got what people politely called mite cheese. That's right, tiny, almost invisible creatures burrowing through the rind, leaving behind a texture that was less aged and more gnawed. Some Victorians swore by it, carving off a slice with pride, while others hacked deep into the wheel, desperately seeking a safe zone. Then there were the outright horrors, cheeses that wriggled with maggots, rinds so thick they crumbled like plaster, preserving powders mixed into the curds that might include borax or alum. Every wheel was a chemical experiment, a time capsule of questionable milk, rough storage, and desperate improvisation. And yet it was loved, because cheese was filling. It was protein. It made a hunk of stale bread feel like a meal. Families treated cheese like treasure. A sliver grated over potatoes could turn dinner into a feast. A crumb tucked into a child's bread was an act of love. Even when it was green, even when it was crawling, Victorians made do. Waste was a sin, and squeamishness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Imagine biting into a chunk, your eyes watering from the sharpness, your jaw aching as the salt and mold bit back. Maybe you carved around the blue veins. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were one of those fearless souls who claimed that the stronger the smell, the healthier the cheese. Either way, every bite was a leap of faith. And still, on the darkest, coldest nights, cheese was comfort. A wedge shared with ale, a slice melted over bread, a tangy bite stolen while the grocer's back was turned. It was food, yes, but it was also survival. and maybe, in a strange way, a dare. Because in Victorian England, every meal carried that unspoken question: will this nourish me, or will this be the one that sends me running for the apothecary? If bread was heavy, jam was fake, and cheese was alive, then fruit was a magician's trick. At first glance, it looked like the safest snack in London. A shiny apple, a basket of pears, maybe even some grapes if you were lucky. Colorful, wholesome, straight from nature, or so you thought. But in Victorian England, nature had help, and not the helpful kind. Street fruit sellers were masters of illusion. A pile of apples gleamed like polished jewels, their skins buffed until you could see your reflection. Mothers would buy them for children, proud of offering something healthy. Except that shine wasn't nature's gloss. It was often wax, polish, or worse, a brush of lead-based powder to make the fruit look fresher than it was. Every bite promised vitamins and minerals, but sometimes delivered chalk dust and poison. And that was only the start. Storage was primitive. Fruit sat in damp cellars or traveled in carts packed with coal dust, horse manure, and flies. By the time it reached a customer's hand, it was bruised, spotted, or halfway to fermentation. No refrigeration, no plastic wrap, no best before dates. Just trust and desperation. Apples were sometimes soaked in chemicals to hide rot. Grapes could be dusted with flour or even plaster to fake freshness. And oranges, if you could afford one, were usually past their prime, their skin rubbed with dye to bring back a hint of color. You might bite into something that looked perfect, only to taste bitterness, grit, or the sour tang of decay. But the danger wasn't only chemical. London's markets teemed with rats, insects, and every crawling thing. Fruit was stored in baskets stacked on damp floors, chewed on by pests and rinsed, if at all in river water better suited for nightmares than drinking. By the time it was sold, you weren't buying an apple. You were buying a ticket to play microbial roulette. And yet, fruit was irresistible. Children begged for it. Workers spent pennies they could barely spare on a piece of sweetness to cut through the gray monotony of bread and porridge. A crisp apple was a rare joy, even if the crunch came with an unexpected surprise, like grit, bugs, or the faint metallic tang of polish. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Streetwise Londoners joked about apples that shone too brightly to be real. Some claimed you could tell a safe piece of fruit by tossing it at a wall. If it bounced, it was waxed. If it splattered, well, at least you didn't eat it. But most people didn't joke. They just ate because hunger doesn't care about shine or polish. And so the fruit seller thrived, calling out his wares with a showman's flair. He knew his customers wanted hope as much as food. A bright apple in a child's hand was more than a snack. It was a promise that life could still taste sweet, even in a city of smoke and soot. Still, as you bit into that glossy apple, you couldn't help but wonder, was that crispness real, or just the crunch of plaster dust between your teeth? Imagine this. You're tired, cold, and your stomach has been growling since dawn. You've had enough of gnawing on stale bread or gambling on glossy apples, so you push open the door of a working-class eatery, a coffee shop or chop house, though both names are more hopeful than accurate. The first thing that hits you isn't comfort. It's the smell. A thick wall of boiled cabbage, scorched fat, and damp wood that clings to your clothes the moment you step inside. The windows are fogged with steam. The tables wobble like they are one bad meal away from collapse, and the lone oil lamp does its best to fight off the London gloom. You look at the menu scratched in chalk on a board by the door. It promises hot stew, fresh chops, and pudding. But those words don't mean what you think they mean. Hot stew could be anything from a few shreds of mutton to yesterday's leftovers drowned in gray water and thickened with more flour than flavor. Fresh chops. Maybe they were fresh once, 3 or 4 days ago. And pudding, well, pudding in Victorian London was more a dare than a dessert. The cook stands behind the counter, apron stained, ladle at the ready, scowl fixed like armor. She slops a portion into a chipped bowl, and you notice a rainbow sheen floating across the surface, a kaleidoscope of fats and oils from generations of mystery meat. Something unidentifiable bobs in the gravy, half potato, half question mark. You poke it with your spoon and try not to think too hard. The other diners don't seem to mind. Men in soot-blackened coats hunch over their bowls, shoveling food in silence. A couple of women stir their tea, if you can call it tea, since the leaves have probably been reused half a dozen times, and nibble bread that looks more like a tool than a loaf. Conversation is rare. In a place like this, you eat fast and keep your doubts to yourself. Hygiene. Let's not even go there. Dishes are rinsed in a pan of tepid water, sometimes with a half-hearted wipe of a greasy rag. Knives and forks are bent, battered, and older than half the customers. Flies claim squatters' rights, buzzing lazily across the tables, daring you to swat them before they land on your food. Still, there's something strangely comforting here. For a few pennies, you're warm, you're full, and you're surrounded by others taking the same risk. There's a camaraderie in surviving a Victorian greasy spoon. Everyone knows the stew might fight back later. Everyone knows the bread is yesterday's. But no one leaves hungry, and in a world where hunger is worse than bad stew, that counts for something. You finish your meal, wipe your bowl clean with a crust of bread, and glance at the stranger across from you. He nods. You nod back. No words are needed. You both know you've just rolled the culinary dice, and at least for now, you've won. Stepping back into the foggy street, your stomach heavy with mystery stew, you can't help but smile. Surviving dinner in Victorian London wasn't about taste. It was about endurance, community, and the quiet pride of knowing you made it through another meal. You've just left the greasy spoon, the taste of mystery stew still clinging to your tongue when you hear it, a bell ringing down the street. The sound is sharp, almost cheerful, cutting through the London fog like a promise. You know that sound. Everyone does. It's the call of the pie man. The pie man is a legend in his own right. He doesn't need a fancy shop front or a chalkboard menu. Just a cart, a stack of hand-sized pastries, and a voice that can cut through the roar of horses and factory whistles. Hot pies, fresh pies. He calls, though both words are lies more often than truth. You push through the crowd, coin ready in your hand. The pies look golden and inviting, their flaky tops brushed with something shiny, maybe egg wash, maybe lard mixed with soot. The smell is intoxicating, a mix of pepper, gravy, and hope. For a penny, you can hold warmth in your hand. For a penny, you can forget what you know about Victorian food safety. You take a bite. The crust shatters between your teeth, salty, greasy, and surprisingly comforting. Then comes the filling. And this, friends, is where optimism meets reality. Instead of beef or lamb, you find a medley of textures. Something stringy, something gelatinous, something that crunches when it really shouldn't. The gravy is thick, peppery, and just opaque enough to hide its secrets. Every chew is a guessing game. Is that tendon? Is that turnip? Or was that fur? Because here's the truth. The pie man was a master of resourcefulness. Nothing went to waste. Heads, feet, skins, organs, even alley cats and stray rats. If it could be chopped, ground, and drowned in gravy, it was fair game. When meat was scarce, he'd bulk it out with breadcrumbs, potato peelings, or whatever scraps the butcher swept off his floor. Sawdust, chalk, even ground bones sometimes found their way into the mix. Rumors swirled through the city. A button found in one pie, a feather in another. One man swore he bit into something with teeth still attached. Were these urban legends or just Tuesday lunch? Nobody knew. And honestly, nobody wanted to. But here's the thing: you keep eating. Because the pie is hot, it's filling. And in a city where factory shifts lasted 12 hours and dinner was never guaranteed, a pie in your hand was survival. Pepper masked the taste, gravy softened the chew, and denial did the rest. You toss the empty tin into the gutter and lick the grease from your fingers. Your stomach is full. Your conscience is uneasy. And deep down, you know you may never really find out what was inside. But for now, you've joined the millions of Victorians who trusted the pie man, not because he was honest, but because he was there. In Victorian London, eating wasn't about flavor. It was about faith. Faith that the crust would hold. Faith that the filling wouldn't kill you. Faith that tomorrow the pie man would still be ringing his bell. The pie man's bell fades into the fog behind you, but the street still hums with the call of vendors. And then it hits you, that smell. Sharp, briny, and just a little bit rotten. You've wandered into the domain of the Victorian fishmonger. The river in Victorian London was infamous. A swirling soup of industrial runoff, human waste, and the occasional floating surprise best left unnamed. Yet here at the fish stall, it is proudly advertised as fresh from the river this morning. Which, in fairness, it probably was. The problem is, the river itself was more cesspool than sea. You hand over a coin for an oyster, the cheapest protein of the working class. Once oysters were food for kings. In the 19th century, they were food for everyone, precisely because there were so many. And the truth, nobody wanted them. They were slimy, gritty, and carried only a small chance of ruining your week with cholera. The oyster man shucks it right there in front of you. His knife is dull, his hands are stained with brine and soot, and the shell cracks open with a squelch that makes you question your life choices. He sprinkles on a dash of pepper, maybe a squirt of vinegar if he's feeling generous, and hands it to you. The crowd urges you on. You tip your head back, swallow the oyster whole, and wait. The taste is overwhelming. Cold, metallic, more mud than sea. There's a crunch where no crunch should be, and yet you don't spit it out. Because oysters are cheap, they are filling, and in a city where bread is padded with chalk and pies come with mystery fur, a slimy shellfish doesn't seem that bad. But oysters were only the beginning. Beside them, piles of cockles, winkles, and mussels, all heaped in paper cones, steaming in the open air. They sit for hours in the sun, soaking up city soot and the buzz of flies. The fishmonger wipes his knife on his apron, then on his hand, then back to the oysters. Hygiene isn't a rule here, it's more of a theory. And then there are the eels. London adored fish pies, too, made their appearance, though what fish had actually gone into them was anyone's guess. Something chewy, something flaky, something suspiciously bony. All drowned in thick gravy and hidden under a crust. It was a meal. It was protein, and it was also occasionally a medical emergency. But for all their risks, fish stalls thrived. They were noisy, lively, full of banter and bargaining. Families gathered around them, workers grabbed snacks on the way home, and children slurped winkles from their shells like a dare. The smell clung to the air, to your clothes, to your very skin. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. Victorians loved their fish, Not because it was safe, but because it was there. Because when hunger gnawed at your belly and coins were scarce, you learned not to ask too many questions. You swallowed, you prayed, and you hoped tomorrow's oyster wouldn't be your last. Hey guys, let's not leave Victorian dining without peeking into one more corner of their culinary chaos, soups. You might think soup is safe. How wrong you'd be. Imagine yourself stepping into a dim tavern or a working-class chop house. You're cold, your hands numb from London's damp fog, and a steaming bowl seems like salvation. The innkeeper slaps down a cracked bowl with a slosh that leaves half the broth on the table. At first glance it looks harmless, clear liquid, maybe a carrot slice, maybe a shred of meat. But the first spoonful tells the truth. Victorian soup was less a recipe and more a storage method for odds and ends. A pot could simmer for days, sometimes weeks, with new scraps tossed in whenever available. Yesterday's bones, today's cabbage stalks, tomorrow's questionable sausage ends, all bubbled together in a perpetual brew locals called everlasting soup. The longer it boiled, the less anyone knew what was actually inside. Some families joked their soup was older than the children eating it. Others didn't joke at all. The flavor. Imagine the tang of turnip, the fatness of mystery meat, the bitter sting of coal smoke drifting in from the hearth, all blending into a taste that could only be described as survival. Some broth had such a greasy sheen it looked like a rainbow floating on the surface. If you were unlucky, the rainbow wasn't from fat. It was from whatever had spoiled but still made it into the pot. And then there was the texture. Broth thickened with flour or breadcrumbs stretched the pot further, but sometimes the cook improved it with bone dust or alum. You dip your bread, scoop up a bite, and crunch on something that should never crunch. Still, hot soup was hot soup. On a freezing day, workers lined up gladly, swallowing each spoonful with the kind of hope only hunger can create. Children were often fed gruel, a thin cousin of soup, more water than grain. Dickens wasn't exaggerating. Gruel was the gray fuel of Victorian poverty, served with little sugar, less milk, and a lot of resentment. Yet for some kids, it was the only meal between sunrise and sleep. The soup kettle told the truth about Victorian life. The rich had consommes served in gleaming tureens. The poor had a pot of perpetual broth, stirred until it turned into a history lesson in liquid form. And for everyone in between, soup was the edible shrug of an empire, hot, cheap, and just nutritious enough to keep you alive for another day. So next time you savor a bowl of creamy chowder or chicken noodle that actually contains chicken, remember this: your soup isn't fighting to kill you. That's a modern miracle, and you owe it to a century of people who had no choice but to risk it all for a warm mouthful of broth. Now let's pour ourselves a cup of Victorian tea, or at least what passed for it. Because if you thought tea was the one safe refuge in a world of chalky bread, glowing candy, and mystery pies, think again. Even tea could be a scam. Picture a poor family sitting down at the end of a long day. The pot is set on the table, steam curling up from a chipped kettle. But inside, those leaves have already been used 2, maybe 3 times. Real tea was expensive, so thrifty households dried the leaves in the oven and brewed them again, sometimes padding the mixture with bits of hedge leaves or colored straw. The color looked right, but the taste, well, let's just say historic is the kindest word. And sugar, that luxury that made even the roughest brew palatable, out of reach for many. So grocers sometimes offered what they called sugar crystals. Except those crystals weren't always sugar. More than a few households discovered they'd been sweetening their tea with gypsum, sand, or even powdered glass. Imagine sipping your evening cup and crunching down on what felt like gravel. For Victorians, that wasn't a surprise. It was just Tuesday. If you were lucky enough to afford genuine tea, there was still the problem of adulteration. Unscrupulous merchants sometimes used leaves with copper sulfate or iron filings to give them a fresh green shine. Every sip was a chemical cocktail disguised as comfort. And yet, tea was more than a drink. It was ritual, it was community, it was the pause in a day that rarely offered one. Families gathered around it, even if the taste was bitter, even if it left a strange tang in the mouth. Factories also ran on tea. Breaks were short, meals meager, but a weak, lukewarm brew carried in a dented tin mug gave workers the illusion of strength. Children sipped it too because water was riskier. And milk, well, we already know what horrors hid in that. Tea, even in its most dubious form, felt safe. And safety, even when it was just an illusion, was worth clinging to. By the time night fell, the kettle had been refilled so many times the tea inside was barely more than tinted water. But families drank it anyway, savoring the warmth more than the taste, and telling themselves they'd had a proper meal. In truth, tea in Victorian England wasn't really about refreshment. It was about endurance. It was about tricking yourself into believing that life was civilized, even when everything around you was raw, dirty, and unforgiving. So the next time you sip a fresh cup of Earl Grey or chamomile before bed, take a second to be grateful. No gypsum, no grass clippings, no copper dust. Just tea, pure, simple, honest. A luxury so ordinary now that we forget how extraordinary it truly is. If tea was the daily comfort, then beer and gin were the daily escape. And trust me, Victorian drinks came with just as much danger as the food. Start with beer. It wasn't the crisp pint you might picture today. It was often weak, watery, and brewed under conditions that would make a modern brewer faint. Taverns stretched their barrels with water, sometimes with salt, sometimes with whatever liquid was handy. To bring back the bite, they added strange extras, iron filings for bitterness, tobacco juice for color, and even sulfuric acid to give it a kick. Imagine heading to your local pub for a pint and walking away with a mouthful of chemistry experiment. That was everyday life. And then there was gin. Cheap gin flooded London's slums, sold by the glass, the jug, or even a thimble. It was nicknamed Mother's Ruin for good reason. Distillers often padded it with turpentine or sulfur, and the flavor was so harsh it was chased with sugar, which, as we've already seen, wasn't always sugar at all. But for the working poor, gin was fuel. It dulled the hunger, blurred the misery, and made the smog-filled streets seem a little less heavy, if only for an hour. Even children weren't spared from this liquid lottery. Street vendors sold penny lemonade or soda waters, brightened with the same toxic dyes that colored candies. A glass of bright yellow fizz might contain more lead than lemon. And yet, the spectacle of bubbles rising in a cup was irresistible. It was magic in a world where magic usually meant hunger. Parents often looked the other way, glad their children were happy, even if it meant a stomachache later. Water, ironically, was often the most dangerous drink of all. Pulled straight from pumps and rivers, it carried cholera, typhoid, and diseases no one yet understood. So people turned to beer, gin, and soda not because they wanted to gamble with their health, but because the alternative was worse. Drinking was survival. The question wasn't whether your drink would be pure, but whether it would kill you slower than the water did. And yet, there's something hauntingly human about this. Imagine sitting in a crowded pub, candles flickering in the foggy night, workers shoulder to shoulder, clinking mugs filled with something that might burn your throat or numb your tongue. Laughter cuts through the gloom, songs rise above the clatter, and for a brief moment, nobody cares what's really in the glass. Because in that instant, the drink isn't poison, it's relief. So next time you open a clean bottle of soda or sip a safe pint of beer, remember that it took generations of trial, error, and tragedy to get here. Victorians raised their glasses too, but they raised them to survival, not to taste. If you really want to understand Victorian junk food and drink, you can't skip the pubs and taverns. These weren't just places to eat and drink. They were survival centers, social hubs, and sometimes the only warm rooms people could afford to sit in. Step into a smoky Victorian tavern. The air is thick with coal dust, pipe smoke, and the sour tang of spilled ale. The wooden tables are scarred from decades of elbows and knives, the floor sticky with layers of beer that have soaked in and never quite dried. The smell, equal parts comforting and alarming, a mix of roasted meat, wet wool, and something metallic, like a hint of rust. The food on offer wasn't much better than the streets, but at least it was hot. A bowl of stew might contain recognizable chunks of mutton, or it might be mostly fat and onions simmered in reused broth. Bread came hard as brick, used more for soaking up grease than for enjoyment. Sausages sizzled on iron pans, seasoned heavily with pepper not for flavor but to disguise whatever had been minced into them. And pies, of course. Always pies. Tavern pies were no less mysterious than those on the street, just served with a bit more ceremony and a pint to wash them down. But it wasn't only about food. Taverns were where news spread, where songs were sung, where the working class gathered to forget a day spent in factories or on the docks. Gin was cheap, beer was plentiful, and no one asked too many questions about the ingredients. A pint of bitter could warm your belly even if it scraped your throat raw, and a glass of gin might numb the ache in your back, even if it stole a little of your memory by morning. And yet, despite the risks, there was joy. Men laughed, women gossiped, children played at the edges while their parents nursed drinks. Street musicians wandered in, fiddles squealing over the din, while dice and cards clicked in corners. Life was grim, but the tavern made it bearable. It was a place where you didn't have to think about the chalk in your bread or the arsenic in your sweets. For an hour or two, you belonged to a crowd, warmed by firelight and fueled by food that might kill you, but at least filled your belly. And here's the irony. Many Victorians lived longer than anyone expected, despite eating and drinking things we wouldn't let near our pets today. Maybe it was resilience, maybe luck, or maybe just sheer stubbornness. But they kept raising their glasses, clinking them together with the same toast every night, to health. Even when health was the very thing they were gambling with. Let's leave the smoky tavern behind and step into another corner of Victorian life that was just as risky, maybe even worse. I'm talking about patent medicines, miracle tonics, and so-called health drinks that promised vitality but usually delivered poison. Imagine walking down a London street in 1870. Posters shout at you from every brick wall. Dr. So-and-so's elixir of life, guaranteed to cure all ailments. Bottles sparkle in apothecary windows, filled with glowing liquids in shades no fruit or flower ever produced. You're tired, your stomach aches from yesterday's pie of mystery, and you think maybe this little bottle of restorative cordial will help. Inside, A cocktail of alcohol, opium, cocaine, arsenic, and a dash of food die for flair. One sip and you'd feel amazing, warm, energized, pain fading. 2 sips and you'd be floating. But give it a week and you're hooked. Victorians didn't use the word addiction the way we do today. Back then, it was just medicine. Parents gave their infants laudanum syrup to stop them crying. Workers gulped down tonics to make it through 12-hour shifts. Housewives sipped arsenic water for clear skin. And the ads were relentless. Illustrated handbills showed glowing children, rosy-cheeked mothers, strong men flexing, all thanks to the latest bottled miracle. Some even claimed to cure cholera or tuberculosis. Others were sold as brain tonics for overworked gentlemen. In reality, these bottles were liquid traps, short-term comfort, long-term ruin. What's chilling is how ordinary it all seemed. Buying a bottle of Godfrey's cordial for your baby was as normal then as grabbing cough syrup off the shelf today. Except this cough syrup could stop your child's lungs. Arsenic wafers, opium drops, cocaine lozenges. You could get them at any chemist, no questions asked. And yet in the Victorian world, these drinks filled a gap. People were exhausted, hungry, constantly fighting off infections. Modern medicine wasn't there yet, so desperation met opportunity. If a bottle claimed to bring relief, even for an hour, people paid their last penny. It was hope in liquid form, even if it was laced with death. Think about it. You're a worker with blisters on your hands, a cough from coal smoke, and a headache that won't quit. Someone sells you a tonic that makes you feel like you can breathe again, sleep again, live again. Do you ask what's in it? Or do you just drink and pray? That was Victorian junk food sibling. Victorian junk medicine. Both dangerous, both addictive, and both proof of just how far people will go to ease the grind of daily survival. Let's keep walking through those crowded Victorian streets, because it wasn't just the food or the medicine that could finish you. It was the drinks too. Picture this. It's a sweltering summer afternoon in London, smoke in the air, sweat on your back, and you hear a vendor calling out, ginger beer, lemonade, ice-cold soda. Sounds refreshing, right? Except this isn't the soda you know today. This is Victorian street soda, a roulette wheel in a bottle. Take ginger beer, for example. It was everywhere, cheap, fizzy, and loved by children and factory workers alike. But here's the catch. It wasn't made in some hygienic brewery. It was usually mixed in a wooden barrel, stirred with whatever stick happened to be handy, and bottled in reused stone jugs sealed with cork and string. And fermentation. Oh, it was unpredictable. Sometimes you got a mild, sweet fizz. Other times you got a miniature bomb. Whole cases of ginger beer bottles were known to explode in storage, turning cellars into battlegrounds of glass shrapnel and sticky foam. And lemonade, bright, cheerful, sweet. Except real lemons were expensive. So most of what you were drinking was citric acid powder, sugar when available, and a splash of questionable water. That same water that carried cholera and typhoid from the Thames straight into your cup. Add a little coal tar dye for color, and suddenly your refreshing lemonade had the hue of industrial runoff. But the real prize for Victorian drinks goes to soda fountains and chemists who fancied themselves scientists. They sold concoctions with names like sparkling health water and invigorating lemon phosphate. Sounds good, until you realize these were laced with things like bromide salts, cocaine extracts, and even strychnine in small doses. Because someone claimed it stimulated the system. Imagine sipping what you think is a harmless tonic only to discover you're basically drinking diluted rat poison with bubbles. Children loved these drinks, of course. The fizz was magic, the sweetness rare, the colors dazzling. Parents encouraged it, thinking carbonation was good for the stomach. And maybe it was, until the additives caught up with you. But in a world where beer was safer than water, soda seemed almost angelic in comparison. The irony, some of these Victorian sodas were advertised as health drinks. Coca wine, a mix of Bordeaux wine and coca leaves, was hailed as a miracle pick-me-up. One sip and you'll conquer fatigue. The ads promised. They weren't lying. With that much cocaine and alcohol, you really would feel invincible for a while. Doctors even prescribed it. Clergymen praised it. And exhausted workers swore by it. But the crash, the dependency, the quiet wreckage it left behind, that was the part the posters never showed. So next time you crack open a cold can of Coke or grab a ginger ale from the fridge, think about the Victorian version. Exploding bottles, toxic dyes, disease-ridden water, and secret chemical cocktails. A drink wasn't just a drink back then. It was an adventure, a gamble you swallowed with a smile, hoping the fizz in your throat didn't come with a fever in the night. We've sipped the soda, but now it's time to step into the true beating heart of Victorian refreshment, alcohol. And trust me, it wasn't just a drink, it was survival. Imagine the narrow streets of London at twilight. Gas lamps flicker, horse hooves clatter on cobblestones, and every corner is glowing with neon light, or at least the Victorian version of neon, brilliantly polished gin palaces. These weren't dingy taverns. No, they were cathedrals of intoxication. Huge glass windows, glittering chandeliers, etched mirrors reflecting rows of bottles like jewels. And at the center of it all, gin. Cheap, harsh, and everywhere. Gin was nicknamed Mother's Ruin, and for good reason. For a few pennies, you could drink yourself out of hunger, grief, or the endless grind of factory life. It burned like fire going down, but it dulled the pain of poverty better than any doctor could. By the 1840s, gin palaces were packed with men, women, and yes, even children sipping small gin cut with water. The line between medicine and booze blurred completely. A tot of gin for teething babies. Perfectly normal. Gin and bitters as a digestive cure, practically a prescription. And then there was beer, the working man's liquid bread. Safer than water, it was brewed everywhere from grand breweries to back alley coppers that might or might not have been scrubbed since the Crimean War. The strength varied wildly. Some ales were mild and nourishing, others so potent they could knock out a dockworker after 2 mugs. But it didn't matter. Beer was calories, beer was hydration, and beer was the fuel of Victorian industry. But here's the part that would shock modern drinkers: adulteration. Just like food, Victorian booze was almost always improved. Copper salts gave beer a deeper color. Lead shavings made cider taste sweeter. Even sulfuric acid got added to wines to mimic age. Drinking wasn't just risky because of intoxication. It was chemical warfare in a glass. The gin palaces knew how to dress it up, though. Gleaming counters, gaslit mirrors, and promises of purity painted in gold leaf across the walls. Step inside and you'd feel rich, even if you were spending your last penny on liquid ruin. Social critics of the day were horrified. Pamphlets warned of gin-mad mothers neglecting their children, of families torn apart, of entire neighborhoods drowning in drunkenness. And yet the palaces thrived. Because when your world was soot, hunger, and ceaseless labor, A few gulps of oblivion felt like freedom. And then, of course, there were the oddities. Patent medicines laced with alcohol, sold openly to housewives as restoratives. Tonics for exhaustion, cordials for nerves, all sold with a wink and a promise. Half the city was drinking and the other half was quietly drunk without even realizing it. So picture yourself now. You step out of the smog into a glittering palace of mirrors, order a penny gin, and let the burn warm your chest. You laugh, you forget. You live if only for an hour. That was the Victorian escape. Not healthy, not safe, but essential. Because in a world where food poisoned you and water betrayed you, sometimes a strong drink was the only friend you could trust. Hey guys, so you've had your gin, your beer, maybe even a sip of a restorative tonic that promised to cure your nerves and instead left you swaying on your way home. But what about dessert? Because if you think alcohol was risky, wait until you see what Victorians considered a sweet ending to their meals. Picture a dimly lit London kitchen, coal smoke drifting through the air, a battered tin pot steaming on the stove. Inside is pudding, though don't imagine the creamy custard you know today. This was more like a dense, sticky brick made of stale bread, a splash of chalky milk, and maybe a handful of dried fruit if fortune smiled. To the hungry, it was heaven. To the modern stomach, it was more like edible punishment. And yet, pudding was everywhere. Penny pudding sold by street vendors became the poor man's dessert. Sweet, filling, and hot in your hands, perfect for cold nights, even if what you were really eating was yesterday's leftovers mashed into a paste. The skin on top, thick, rubbery, sometimes singed black, sometimes flavored by whatever grease clung to the cooking tin. Kids tore into it with sticky fingers anyway, grinning through the grit. Then there were pastries. Golden on the outside, mystery on the inside. Bakers used improved flour padded with chalk or plaster, which gave their tarts a satisfying crunch for all the wrong reasons. Add in a dab of cheap jam, mostly apple cores dyed red, and you had a Victorian fruit tart. Elegant on the plate, catastrophic in the belly. Even fancier desserts weren't safe. Ice cream carts offered colorful scoops that glowed like gemstones, but that color came from arsenic green, lead yellow, or copper blue. One lick and your tongue tingled, 2 licks and you started wondering if that dizziness was excitement or poisoning. Hygiene? Forget it. Scoops were shared across customers, ice came from polluted rivers, and milk was whatever hadn't gone sour yet. And of course, no Victorian sweet shop was complete without hard candies. The acid drops, bull's eyes, and jawbreakers kids loved to smash their teeth against. They looked magical in jars, dazzling in every shade of unnatural green and crimson. But those colors came with a dose of heavy metals that slowly chewed away at health as effectively as the candy chewed away at enamel. But here's the thing. Dessert wasn't just food. It was defiance. It was joy. For children raised on gray bread and bitter cabbage, a penny sweet or a pudding slice felt like a miracle. They knew the risks. They saw the newspaper scandals about arsenic lozenges and poisoned peppermints, but they bought them anyway. Because in a world of endless smoke and struggle, dessert, even toxic dessert, was a chance to taste happiness. So imagine yourself standing at a Victorian fairground. A toffee apple cracks like glass under your teeth. A fried fritter drips with rancid oil, and a jawbreaker nearly loosens a molar. You laugh, you wince, and you keep eating. Because that was the deal in Victorian England. Every bite a gamble, every sweet a story, and every meal a lesson in resilience. Before we let the curtains close on this wild culinary chapter, let's peel back the final layer of the Victorian pantry. The scandals that made people finally sit up, take notice, and demand change. Because while we laugh now about green candy and chalk bread, these weren't just quirky food habits. They were tragedies waiting to happen, and sometimes they did. Picture London in the 1850s. Newspapers screaming with headlines about a sweet shop in Bradford where children dropped like flies after eating peppermint lozenges. The culprit: a careless confectioner who accidentally mixed arsenic into the sugar supply. More than 20 people died and dozens more fell violently ill. It was one of the deadliest food poisoning incidents in British history, and it jolted the public awake. Suddenly, candy wasn't just a treat, it was a gamble with your life. But it wasn't only candy. Bread, the so-called staff of life, came under fire too. Investigators discovered bakers mixing alum and plaster into loaves to keep them unnaturally white and fluffy. Doctors began connecting stomach pains, rashes, and wasting illnesses to these additives. What shocked people most wasn't the trick itself, but how common it was. Nearly every bakery was guilty. Milk was no safer. In urban slums, inspectors found pails watered down until they were half liquid chalk. Worse still, in an attempt to stretch profits, some suppliers laced the mix with formaldehyde, a chemical that preserved corpses, not children's breakfasts. Outrage grew when infant deaths were traced back to these tainted bottles. For Victorian families already struggling with high child mortality, the thought that pure milk was killing babies was almost unbearable. Each scandal chipped away at the public's blind trust, and with every new revelation, voices grew louder demanding government action. Journalists exposed the frauds, reformers shouted in Parliament, and scientists began running tests in crude laboratories, trying to prove what ordinary people already suspected, that their daily bread, milk, and sweets were poisoning them. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but eventually change came. By the late 19th century, the first real food safety laws were passed. Inspectors had authority to test goods, fines were issued, and labels slowly became a legal requirement. For the first time, people began to believe that what they bought might actually be what it claimed to be. And that's the hidden legacy of Victorian junk food. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, it was absurd. But it was also the spark that created modern food safety. Those scandals, the poisoned candy, the chalk bread, the tainted milk, pushed society to build protections we still rely on today. So when you glance at the back of a cereal box and skim through the ingredient list, remember this wasn't always the norm. It was hard-won, built on the stomachaches, scandals, and sacrifices of people who lived through the Victorian food lottery. Their misfortune is why we can snack without fear today. And maybe, just maybe, that's the strangest comfort of all. Let's step away from the big headlines for a moment and walk into an ordinary Victorian home. Because behind every scandal and every shocking discovery, there were families trying their best to survive, parents trying to feed their kids, and children learning far too young that food wasn't always a friend. Picture a mother in a narrow London alley, her baby crying in her arms. She saves every penny to buy a bottle of milk, believing it will strengthen her child. But the milkman has stretched it with water and chalk, and within days the baby develops a fever that never breaks. The neighbors whisper about summer complaint, but no one dares accuse the milkman. He's just doing what everyone does. And so, another small grave is dug in the churchyard. Or think about the factory worker, a man who wakes before dawn, stuffs a piece of bread in his pocket and trudges off to a 12-hour shift. By noon, his teeth ache from chewing through plaster-thick crust. He shrugs it off. What choice does he have? Hunger is worse than chalk. He dreams of payday when maybe he can afford a slice of cheese, though even that might come with maggots. Still, he eats. He has to. Work won't wait for an empty stomach. And then there are the children. Street kids who crowd around candy stalls, their eyes shining at the bright emerald sweets in the jar. They don't know the color comes from arsenic. Or maybe they do, but they don't care. For one glorious moment they taste sugar, they laugh with each other, and they forget the soot, the cold, and the hunger. If sickness comes later, well, that's tomorrow's problem. What strikes us now, looking back, is how normal it all was. To Victorians, bad food wasn't a scandal. It was just life. They didn't have the luxury of rejecting it. They couldn't afford to toss away a loaf with mold or question why their porridge tasted metallic. You ate what you had, and you prayed it gave you strength instead of sickness. It's easy for us to laugh today about glowing candy or sawdust pies. But for them, every bite was a choice between hunger and risk. And when your family depended on you, risk almost always won. That's why the resilience of these people is so astonishing. They didn't just survive, they endured. They built communities, raised children, and carried on through a world where even dinner could betray them. And in that endurance, they laid the groundwork for change. Because eventually, their suffering became impossible to ignore. Doctors started keeping records. Reformers started writing reports. Ordinary people began demanding better. And from their struggles came the beginnings of a safer food system, one where a mother could trust the milk she poured and a child could eat candy without risking their life. So the next time you bite into something simple, an apple, a slice of bread, a scoop of ice cream, think of them. The forgotten men, women, and children whose daily battles with Victorian junk food built the protections we take for granted today. Let's talk about the people who refuse to stay quiet. Because as outrageous as Victorian junk food was, not everyone accepted it as the price of survival. A handful of reformers, journalists, and doctors looked at the endless chalk-filled bread, arsenic-dyed candy, and toxic milk and said, "Enough." One of the loudest voices was Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall, a London physician who started testing food from markets and publishing his findings in The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals of the time. Imagine being a Victorian reader, sipping your weak tea, only to discover in black and white that the sugar you stirred into it might actually be ground gypsum. Hassall's reports were shocking. He exposed everything from iron filings in pepper to red lead in candy. For the first time, people had proof, not just rumors, that their daily meals could be lethal. Then came the journalists. Newspapers loved a good scandal, and the idea that bakers were patting out bread with sawdust or that candy sellers were poisoning children with arsenic made for sensational headlines. The Times ran exposés. Satirical cartoons showed chalk men serving bread, and suddenly the quiet whispers of street corners became loud demands for accountability. Parliament, of course, dragged its feet. Politicians were more concerned about upsetting businessmen than protecting the poor. But pressure mounted. Mothers who lost children, workers who fell sick, reformers who refused to stop publishing their grim findings. Together, they created a storm too strong to ignore. The result was the Adulteration of Food Act of 1860, a first attempt to put some guardrails around food production. It was weak, full of loopholes and rarely enforced, but it was a start. Later acts in the 1870s and beyond strengthened the rules, slowly pushing the market toward honesty. Inspectors were appointed, fines were levied, and although corruption still ran deep, the tide had turned. But let's not romanticize it. Change was painfully slow. For every dishonest baker fined a few shillings, a dozen more went about business as usual. And families didn't always trust reformers either. Some believed the government exaggerated dangers, while others simply couldn't afford pure food, even if it was available. Survival often meant looking the other way. Yet, reformers kept going. They believed that eating shouldn't be an act of gambling with your life. They argued that food should nourish, not poison. And though it took decades, their persistence laid the foundation for modern food laws, the kind that let you buy bread without fearing it might contain plaster dust. Think about that the next time you see a nutrition label or a best before date. Those little words are the descendants of Victorian outrage, born from chalky bread, glowing candy, and 1,000 tiny tragedies. Picture this. It's a chilly afternoon in 1858, and children crowd around a little sweet shop in Bradford, England. The window jars sparkle with green candies, apple lozenges so bright they look like gemstones. To poor kids living on gray porridge and hard bread, these sweets are irresistible. Parents scrape together a penny or two, handing them over for a rare treat. Nobody suspects what's inside. But those candies weren't flavored with apple extract or colored with some innocent plant dye. No, their vivid green came from arsenic trioxide, a deadly compound used in rat poison. The shopkeeper hadn't meant to sell poison. The disaster started when a wholesaler accidentally supplied arsenic instead of harmless filler. But here's the real horror. Victorian food regulation was so lax that no one checked, no one tested, and no one stopped it from reaching the hands of children. Within hours, kids were collapsing. Nausea, cramps, vomiting, seizures. The doctors at first thought it was cholera. It always was cholera in those days. But soon the truth became undeniable. By the time the dust settled, more than 200 people were sick and at least 20 were dead. From candy, sweet, innocent candy. The newspapers exploded with outrage. Headlines screamed about poison lozenges, and grieving parents held up the handfuls of green death that had stolen their children. For the first time, Victorians had to face the ugly truth. Their food supply was not just adulterated, it was downright dangerous. And yet, here's the part that chills you. This wasn't the only case. Arsenic wasn't some bizarre accident, it was everywhere. Used in dyes, in wallpaper, even in beer because it made colors vivid and products cheaper. And because it wasn't illegal, shopkeepers could shrug and say, "I didn't know." The Bradford case finally forced Parliament to act. The outcry led to stronger enforcement of the Adulteration Acts and new pressure on chemists to test products. But even then, change crawled. For decades, children still sucked on lead-painted sweets. Adults still ate bread bulked with chalk, and milk still fizzed with hidden chemicals. The reforms came too late for the victims of Bradford, but their deaths became a turning point. A tragedy that made people realize food safety wasn't just a nuisance. It was life or death. And honestly, it makes you wonder. If we hadn't had those scandals, if children hadn't died in the dozens from candy, would we have ever gotten modern food safety laws? Or would we still be gambling every time we reached for a snack? Let's be honest. Eating in Victorian England was risky enough, but drinking, that was a whole new lottery. Imagine you're parched after a long day in a soot-filled factory. You reach for a refreshing drink, and congratulations, you've just swallowed something closer to a chemistry experiment than a beverage. First, let's talk about soda water and fizzy tonics. Victorians adored bubbles. They thought carbonation wasn't just fun, but medicinal. Chemists whipped up health waters laced with exotic names. Lithia water for nerves, iron water for strength, even bromide mixtures to calm the mind. But behind the fancy labels, many were spiked with everything from strychnine in nerve tonics to arsenic in purifying drafts. People genuinely believed these concoctions could cure headaches, indigestion, or hysteria. In reality, they were more likely to cure your need for a functioning liver. Then came sarsaparilla, root beer's chaotic cousin. Vendors hyped it as a miracle elixir, perfect for cleansing the blood. Sometimes it was brewed properly with herbs. More often it was a witch's stew of flavorings, caramel, sugar, and a splash of alcohol strong enough to make your vision wobble. Children sipped it thinking it was candy in a bottle. Parents called it medicine. Doctors, when asked, mostly shrugged. Of course, beer and gin were everywhere. Beer was considered safer than water because it was boiled in brewing, and gin was considered, well, necessary. London's working poor clutched tin cups of cheap gin flavored with turpentine or sulfuric acid to mask how badly it was cut. One writer joked that Victorian gin could strip paint, and honestly, he wasn't exaggerating. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was devastating. And let's not forget lemonade. Sounds innocent, right? But Victorian lemonade wasn't just sugar and citrus. It was often colored with lead acetate for that bright golden shine. Imagine sipping a refreshing glass on a summer day and realizing later your headache and stomach cramps weren't the heat. They were heavy metals creeping through your system. The most bizarre category of all, medicinal cordials. Labels promised relief from coughs, sleeplessness, and the vapors. Reality check. Most of them were just chloroform, opium, or cocaine mixed with sugar water. Kids were given soothing syrups at night, dosed with narcotics that knocked them out cold. Adults drank pick-me-ups laced with coca leaves that kept them buzzing until their hearts begged for mercy. And through it all, Victorians kept sipping, convinced they were getting healthier. A glass of arsenic tonic. Why not? It makes the cheeks rosy. A fizzy soda spiked with mercury salts. Perfect for stimulating digestion. Beer brewed in lead-lined tanks. At least it tasted better than Thames water. Looking back, it feels insane. But at the time, it was normal. No warning labels, no FDA, no nutrition facts. Just blind faith that if it fizzed, burned, or numbed your tongue, it had to be working. So here we are, at the end of our long walk through the darkly comic, stomach-churning world of Victorian junk food and drinks. We've seen pies that might have contained anything with legs, or without them. Bread padded out with chalk, plaster, and brick dust. Milk stretched with water, chalk, or worse. Sweets that sparkled like emeralds because they were laced with arsenic. Ice cream that glowed brighter than the gas lamps. And drinks that promised health but delivered heavy metals, narcotics, and the occasional near-death experience. And somehow, people survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived in their own gritty, stubborn way. They built railways, wrote novels, raised families, and endured, fueled by food that today would probably be classified as hazardous waste. Maybe that's the lesson. Resilience is baked into us, no matter what's on the table. But you and I, we're lucky. We get to end this journey with clean water, safe snacks, and the luxury of reading labels before we take a bite. No need to sniff the bread suspiciously or wonder if your candy will glow in the dark. You can tuck yourself into bed tonight knowing your midnight snack won't come with a side of lead, and your tea won't be laced with arsenic for the color. So, as you close your eyes, maybe send a quiet thank you to those tough, reckless ancestors who ate the glowing candy, drank the fizzing milk, and somehow passed on their iron stomachs so we could be here today. Sleep well, my friends. May your dreams be sweet, your snacks safe, and your night free of glowing candy and meat pies that bite back. Good night.